Hello everybody and welcome to this Zilient live discussion. Today we're going to be talking about insights from the UN climate talks, COP23, and within that we're going to be putting the spotlight on climate resilience. I'm the editor of Zilient.org, which is a global network for resilience practitioners. My name is Megan Rowling. I am also a journalist with the Thomson Reuters Foundation. I reported for Zilient and the Thomson Reuters Foundation from the climate talks this month, where we were on the ground and hearing a lot about the need to build resilience in climate vulnerable countries. This was emphasised often by UN officials, government leaders, experts and activists. Thousands of them were there in Bonn. Of course, fostering resilience is a goal in the Paris Agreement, but it got more of an outing this time at the climate talks than I have heard at previous annual sessions. And I think that was not least because Fiji, an island, developing island nation, was presiding over these talks, and it was battered very badly by Cyclone Winston last year, which was a very powerful cyclone, and killed 44 people there and wiped out about a third of GDP. And so with Fiji leading the proceedings, it was very important to Fiji and a lot of other small island developing nations and indeed other vulnerable countries that there was a focus on how they can become stronger in the face of the more extreme weather and rising seas that climate change is bringing all around the world. So today we have a great panel of experts to fill you in on the key developments for resilience work at Bonn and ask where that leaves us in terms of moving things forward. We have Saleemul, who's director of the International Centre for Climate Change and Development based in Bangladesh, and he is also a senior fellow with the International Institute for Environment and Development in London. We have also Debbie Hillier, who's a senior humanitarian policy advisor with Oxfam GB, and we have Kavanaugh, who is the Resilient Cities Programme Manager at ICLEI, which is a global network of more than 1,500 cities, towns and regions committed to building a sustainable future. So we're going to start by looking at the big picture of the negotiations, and then we're going to drill down into two key areas. First, insurance as a tool to protect countries and communities for climate-related losses, and secondly, ways in which cities and regions are teaming up on climate action. So just to say before we start the conversation with our experts, that we're also broadcasting this live on Zilient's Facebook page, as well as via the webinar. And if you're tweeting about anything our experts say, the main hashtags we're using are hashtag COP23 and hashtag resilience. You'll be welcome to put your questions to the panelists a bit later in the event, so please have a think about what you'd like to ask them. You can do that via the chat function on the side of the screen if you're watching via the webinar system, or if you're on Facebook, you can leave a question underneath this broadcast. So Saleem, I'm going to start with you. You've been watching these negotiations for a really long time, and you've advised countries within the negotiations as well, some of the poorest countries. I mean, to me, it seemed as though resilience was a word that we were hearing much more this time around. In fact, it was mentioned often by the head of the UN Climate Change Secretariat, who said it was in our best collective interest to build resilient societies. From your perspective, what were the most important gains and disappointments at the talks in terms of building resilience in vulnerable countries and communities?
Well, I think the COP23 that just ended in Bonn consists of some successes and some not so successful outcomes. On the whole, I wouldn't say it's a bad outcome, a relatively good one. This was always going to be a relatively technical COP, preparing for the major evaluation that's going to take place, the facilitative dialogue next year in Poland at COP24. So it was setting that in motion. And I think that happened quite well. I think also the presidency of Fiji, being the first small island state to be the president of a COP gave it a different kind of atmosphere, a different kind of feeling. And as you said, Fiji raised the issue of particularly loss and damage and providing innovative finance for loss and damage in the face of many different events, not just Hurricane Winston hitting Fiji, but also the series of Caribbean hurricanes and the major floods in South Asia and many other events around the world this year, which has really been a tipping point in terms of taking us over the threshold of human-induced climate change, actually having impacts and causing losses and damages. So in the climate change context, we've moved beyond simply adaptation, which is preparing for dealing with these impacts, to having to deal with them and dealing with the providing compensation for loss and damage. And so in that sense, I think that particular aspect was less successful, because all we got out of it was insurance as a mechanism, which is fine, but it just doesn't be effective for the most poor, either communities or countries who can't afford the insurance themselves. So we had hoped for something more in terms of innovative finance. We hope to bring this up again next year. There will be further discussions on this. That's a good thing. I think the other positive outcome is what the Fijians call the Talanoa dialogue, which is a Pacific community-based system of achieving consensus and agreement through lots of discussions with different stakeholders, which is a very different paradigm from the adversarial, negative negotiation that we have in the UNFCCC process, which takes arguments over commas and words well into overnight discussions. Very tired delegates really don't even know what they're arguing about, or at least observers don't know what they're arguing about. They may know what they're arguing about, but it doesn't make sense to those who are looking at what they're doing. And really, it isn't a fit for purpose system anymore, in my view. And so this idea of the Talanoa dialogue, where we bring in other groups, we recognize indigenous groups and local groups, and we have a gender action plan coming out of COP23. These may seem minor procedural elements, but I think they are important ones in terms of taking us forward. And the outcome of COP23 is that instead of waiting for a whole year till we get to Katowice in Poland for COP24, both Fiji and Poland, as the outgoing presidency and the incoming presidency, are going to consult very widely with many different stakeholder groups, including civil society, private sector, academia, etc. And hopefully we can build a level of consensus going into Poland before everybody arrives there for the final days of the more intense political negotiations in the normal UN FCC style, which, as I said, you know, after 14 days of negotiations, they still go overtime all night, Friday night, and only came out with an agreement the following morning. I simply don't understand why that has to be the case. If they were going to agree on Saturday, they could have agreed on Friday, but they don't.
It's true. There are many things that appear normal at the climate talks to the rest of the world, just pretty incomprehensible.
That's right. And
but
so,
I think one of the interesting points that you're making is that this dialogue process that's quite central to raising ambition under the Paris Agreement, so we keep to the temperature limits that were agreed in Paris, is that the aim is to bring more people in, groups in than you would expect normally under the UN climate talks. And one of the things that struck me and yourself, I know, at Bonn was the vibrancy and the huge amount of activity that was happening outside of the negotiations. In fact, physically, the negotiations and the discussions and the actions by civil society and business and non-government groups, national government groups, was in a different place and had a totally different atmosphere. I mean, what does that tell us about how action is happening these days? Is there more effort going on to build resilience outside of national governments and negotiating rooms than inside them, Saleem?
Well, after the Paris Agreement was achieved, which was a monumental achievement in my view, a universal achievement, where all countries have agreed to take action, I think the emphasis has shifted to taking action rather than continuing to negotiate words on paper as to how we will take action. And so I mooted the idea of having future COPs being inside-out COPs, where the negotiators now get relegated to the periphery and the actors who are taking actions be given place prominence. And I think to some extent, we actually saw that happening in Bonn, where we had these two zones called the Bula zone and the Bonn zone. Actually misnamed, it should have been the other way around. The Bula zone was where the negotiators were in these, underground chamber, floodlit with artificial light and no natural light, sitting in rooms negotiating, and all the stalls and pavilions and meetings and side events and dancing and music was happening in what was called the Bonn zone, which was much more vibrant with cafes and people meeting and sharing. It really was two different worlds, and they seemed like two different worlds, speaking two different, very different kinds of language. And so the excitement and fun was definitely on the Bonn zone with the actors. And one of the good things about implementing the Paris Agreement is you don't have to have a consensus between 200 countries. You can have coalitions of the willing, small numbers of countries getting together, countries and governments and other actors, civil society and private sector can all move forward. And that's really what we saw happening, wave after wave of groups coming and pledging action, city mayors and provincial governments, subnational governments, and particularly from the United States, we had states, governors of states coming and mayors of towns and head CEOs of companies all coming and said they were still in. On the issue of resilience, I think it's important to note that the term resilience actually doesn't appear much in the formal negotiations. And one of the reasons is it's very difficult to agree on a definition. But as you said, it does get discussed in the discussions. And I think it was particularly apt this year in COP23 because the notion of resilience now is an umbrella term for two very climate change specific terms, which are adapting to climate change and dealing with loss and damage from climate change. Those are the sort of jargon words we use in the Framework Convention negotiation language. But the term resilience encompasses both. You need to be resilient in order to deal with the issue before it arises, and you need to be resilient to bounce back after it happens. So I think the term resilience is now achieving some level of common understanding in that in the climate change parlance, it includes both adaptation and loss and damage, which get bifurcated into two different things in the negotiations, but in principle are really one larger issue, one before the events occur and one after the events occur. And I think we've achieved some level of clarity on that. And so resilience as a term and as a functional idea is becoming much more prevalent.
Thanks, Saleem. That's a really helpful explanation of how it kind of pans out in terms of the negotiations, because there isn't one part of the negotiations only that is about resilience. And I wanted to bring Debbie Hillier from Oxfam GB into the discussion now, because Debbie was following at COP23 all the action around insurance and insurance against climate risks, which as you mentioned, Saleem, was something that we are seeing some progress on. It's only perhaps one element of helping people to become more resilient against the impact of climate change. But Debbie, if you could just fill us in, what were the main points of progress on insurance that we saw at COP23?
Great, thank you. I think just one step backwards, I think one of the kind of broad perspectives of Oxfam kind of across the COP was that despite kind of a very bad year of non-stop disasters, there was actually very little new support for adaptation. There seems to be, there feels to us to be a mismatch between the climate risks that are very evident now in the world. We're not talking about future climate change, this is happening. So there's a mismatch between the climate reality for many people and actually the international response. And of course, Saleem is right, this was quite a technical kind of COP, but still we were looking for we were looking for a broader response around adaptation, a recognition that more needs to be done. There was very little new funding for adaptation, and we're still a long way away from achieving the adaptation goals. That's adaptation. Then, yeah, on loss and damage, yeah, there was, again, very little progress on that apart from insurance. And yes, there was a big launch of something called the Industry Resilience Global Partnership. So there was a high-level launch with all the kind of hoopla that goes with it. And then there was a big one-day session looking at kind of exploring what this partnership is all about. And essentially, this is a global initiative that is looking to support countries to understand their disaster risks more fully and to manage them financially. And insurance is one of the solutions for that. So I think anything that can help countries manage disasters better, I think is clearly not a bad thing. Obviously, you know, Oxfam works with communities all around the world affected by disasters. So, we obviously realise that more needs to be done to plan ahead for disasters. But we are a little bit worried that the partnership isn't quite hitting the right note, that there's still a lot of work to be done to make sure that it does actually work for poor people. And one of the big things that it's very early days in the partnership, so we don't quite know where it's going to go. But at the moment, it's not clear quite how much this focus on disaster risk finance, including insurance, is going to link with disaster risk reduction or adaptation. So, for example, you know, if you've got a community that's subject to flooding, what might the responses be? Well, a finance solution might be to make sure everyone's got insurance against flooding. Or you might decide that actually you need to build some flood defences, which would be DRR. Or do you need to implement new construction planning controls, which would be adaptation? Or do you need to do early warning and evacuation systems, which you might call preparedness? Or do you want to do all of those things? And probably all of those things are important. And it's not clear to me yet how the partnership is going to make that happen, to look at that whole picture and make sure all of those things happen to protect people from disasters. So what we definitely really want to see that this partnership definitely supports sort of risk reduction and adaptation, as well as the financing piece. Both of those are important.
So Debbie, how would Oxfam propose to the Ensure Resilience Partnership that they, a way that they could make sure that they are actually reaching those 400 million more poor people that they've said they're going to provide insurance for by 2020. What would be your recommendations for donor governments and others involved in that partnership to actually know whether that's happening and some of the key things that they should be watching out for?
I guess I'd like to call into question that target for itself. So this target came up from the G7 in 2015, and it was agreed by the G7 to provide insurance for 400 million more people in developing countries by 2020. So they've kind of set themselves this target, which I think was a little bit made up on the back of an envelope. I don't see any particular logic for 400 million as opposed to anything else. And I guess I'd much rather see it back at first principles to what actually can support people who are vulnerable to disasters. And insurance might be the right solution, but it might not. I wouldn't want to, you know, pre-make that decision that insurance is absolutely the right answer. So let's keep a broad perspective first. Let's understand the risk profile and figure out what is the right solution. Certainly, I think the partnership needs to agree some pro-poor principles. If this really is about poor people in developing countries, then let's state that very clearly and embed that very early on in the partnership to then, and rather than retrofit it, you know, a year or so down the line. So let's get those pro-poor principles agreed, and let's make sure one of those is around citizen accountability and participation, because there is a danger that some of this is quite top down. It's driven by donors, it's driven by the World Bank, it's driven by insurers. There's not a lot of community participation in general in some of these schemes. Now, of course, there are schemes which are very bottom up. Oxfam has a couple of insurance programs, World Vision does, Mercy Corps, you know, there are some. But I think we need to marry the top down and the bottom up, and that needs to be quite explicit. And then I think the other thing that's really important is ensuring we get some good monitoring and evaluation on impact of these schemes. Typically, insurance monitoring and evaluation has been how many policyholders are there and what's the sum of the assets insured. That might be fine in some contexts, but it's not enough if we're looking at public money, whether that's donor money or government money. We need to look much more about, is this actually building resilience for poor people, or is it not? And at the moment, frankly, the evidence is a little bit slight on that. And we certainly don't have it disaggregated by gender and by age, by other socioeconomic group. You know, we really need to, if this is a developmental, it's done this with a developmental perspective, we've got to drill down into this. And at the moment, that kind of analysis just isn't there. So it is quite a new area, and, you know, it is an area of innovation, but that means we need to work even harder at the M&E, yeah, to prove whether this is working or not.
I suppose one question that comes to mind based on what you've said is that, you know, we don't know whether insurance is going to do the right thing by people who are suffering the impacts of climate change, and there's a dearth of, or not enough finance for other types of activity such as adaptation. And why are the donors trying to sort of put all their eggs in this insurance basket? I mean, what's the attraction for them, and what other types of finance would Oxfam like to see more of?
I think if I was going to be fair to donors, I don't think they're putting all their eggs in the insurance basket. I think they would push back quite strongly and say we are still funding resilience and adaptation and DRR. But I think the flip side of that is insurance is getting all the airtime. So you know, there's a lot of communications around insurance, and that's partly because, you know, it looks sexy and interesting. You know, this is a kind of innovative new finance. It's driven partly ideologically. Donors like the idea of working with the private sector. The leveraging the private sector, you know, is something that they all love to do. So it's partly driven ideologically. And of course, the insurers love it too. So they're promoting it heavily. So it really does seem to get all the airtime at the moment. And I think that messaging is something that donors are going to have to think about. Because while I don't think they're putting all their money into insurance, I do think some of them are putting quite a lot, and the communication around this is going to be problematic for countries. Actually, it's much more important to reduce that risk, and then what you can't reduce, then you might want to look at insurance, but the risk reduction part has to come first. And I think the other thing that donors need to do is think about funding for other forms of disaster risk finance. So at the moment, through this partnership, there will be some funding for essentially subsidizing insurance. But what they're not doing is offering money to subsidize other forms of risk finance. So contingent credit or contingent loans, forecast-based financing. There are some kind of new interesting areas here, but they're not getting the funding that insurance is getting, and that is problematic. So that's something that the donors really need to work on.
Right, and I also think that funding is potentially an issue for cities and local governments when it comes to building their resilience to climate shocks like floods and storms. And so I wanted to bring Laura in at this point and ask whether there was whether there are any positive signals around issues of financing for cities at COP, and what else happened there that was important for cities and local governments in terms of providing additional support for their work on resilience.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. I think I'll start big and then sort of come down to the finance question there. So in terms of sort of positive outcomes for local and subnational governments at COP23, I think the big summary point that we saw was this real transition from sort of the recognition that local and subnational governments had received in the Paris Agreement. There was this official recognition that we had been fighting for a while of the role and the important contributions of the local and subnational governments. And we shifted a bit from recognition to inclusion. So there were more opportunities, there was increased visibility, there was a sort of shift in tone and language, both sort of informally in discussions and events during the COP and also in the official text and outcome documents. So we were really pleased to see that, and we think that's a very positive signal that they're really being included in this sort of global coalition that the different partners were speaking of, and the concrete contributions were being put forward from cities, and this was also being recognized and sort of brought into the official processes. So a few examples from that, touching on the Talanoa dialogue process, which Saleemul talked about. Cities have been officially invited to give their input to this, and this is something ICLEI is wearing our hat as the focal point for the local government and municipal authorities stakeholder group. This was an idea we had put forward. We're really pleased to see that this was now taken up, this sort of what started as a bottom-up suggestion is now part of the official process, that there'll be discussions between local and subnational governments in countries and capitals, and this will feed into that official dialogue on how to improve the NDCs, the adaptation, the mitigation, climate action plans. So that was one really great outcome for us. Something else we saw more and more, as we were saying, it was a bit more of a technical COP. So there was focus on how to improve the technical meetings and partnerships and processes here. And we were hearing this recognition and interest to strengthen ties between the official TEMS and TEPS, technical expert meetings, with those links to the Marrakesh Partnership for Global Climate Action. And this is a platform that has been really mobilizing coalitions of different stakeholders, and this was happening in the Bonn zone in parallel. There were high-level roundtables and discussions on all different themes with all different stakeholders, and local governments were very visible here as well, both on their sort of official SDG 11 and human settlements days, but also as a cross-cutting actor for other issues. So strengthening those ties between the stakeholders and the Bula and the Bonn zones, so to speak, was something we really welcomed. And one concrete example was for the first time, we had this major climate summit of local and regional leaders hosted in the Bonn zone, the civil society zone, and there was a lot of connection between the national leaders, UN institutional partners, the presidency, and local and subnational leaders on the stage, just physically, but also in what they were presenting and how we were linking these different initiatives. So the outcomes there, the commitments that were presented there, and how it's linking to the agreements informally and informally was also a really positive sign. One last example was that ICLEI, as a local government association, has become a first associate member of the NDC partnership. So it's recognizing officially the contributions of local governments in implementing in improving the process and how we can better implement and create the NDCs. So those were some high-level examples of how we've sort of shifted to really engaging more with the local governments. There was a couple other points here for why this COP stood out, especially on adaptation in local governments. It so happened that this year, the Nairobi Work Program, which focuses on adaptation, that's a technical committee on adaptation, they have a focal point forum every year. And this year, the focus was on human settlements. So there was a very nice discussion that happened. There was input from experts, and then there was this dialogue between delegates and officials and experts and local governments during the COP in the official zone to better understand how we can build this shared vision and this shared agenda on adaptation between local leaders and national leaders, and how to officially connect the processes of supporting local governments with their plans and how the contributions at the local level are feeding into the national plans as well. And this is a process that will continue into the talks next year. So that was really in focus in the technical discussions too, which was quite positive. And we saw some things sort of put on the table. For example, the Frontline Cities and Islands Initiative. This is a partnership between GLISPA, the Global Island Partnership, and ICLEI, which is supporting this knowledge exchange. That was one of the gaps that we're seeing. How can we really better facilitate these stakeholder partnerships for knowledge development on adaptation and resilience at the local level, connecting to global processes? And that was one example where we're not waiting, we're sort of taking action while this is going on at the global level. So coastal cities and cities in small islands are coming together to share that knowledge and to support each other, also on the finance aspects.
That sounds like a really interesting and potentially fruitful partnership. And I was just going to say one thing that really occurred or bubbled up very strongly during all the local governments and cities events. I attended the summit, part of it that you mentioned, in the middle weekend of the talks. There was a very strong and vocal and vibrant presence there from US states, and some great speeches from people like the California governor and others, and with a really strong message that, you know, we're still in the Paris Agreement, even though the national government wants to withdraw. How is that playing out in terms of formal involvement of cities and local governments in the Paris Agreement? At the moment, there's all this stuff happening, but there isn't actually a way to incorporate formally the actions that have been taken by US local governments and states and cities into the Paris Agreement. What was being said around that at Bonn?
So one of the kind of themes that was also emerging in these discussions in anticipation of that stock-taking exercise that will happen next year was how we can better monitor and count the different contributions that are happening at all levels. So that was, I think, where this conversation really came together, because cities, through initiatives, one major one being the Global Covenant of Mayors on Climate and Energy, they're already counting these actions, and they have their emissions plans, they have their adaptation plans now. There's a standardized form that through this initiative that just this year, to our one piece of it, we had 200 subnational governments reporting, and there's other actors that are collecting information as well. So in total, there's over 1,000 local governments reporting to these shared, to our platform, different information. So what this is doing, it's collecting and being able to monitor what cities are doing on mitigation, on adaptation. They're putting forward their plans, and this is helping to increase that visibility. And we're working with the UN Secretariat to connect that process to the NDC and the NAP processes as well, so you can count what they're doing at the local level towards the national level contributions. And this conversation was something that link was being made repeatedly, because this question of monitoring and transparency was a major point coming into the COP, with the UN Environment Adaptation Gap focused on this very issue. And then the negotiators were, of course, very interested to see how to make this happen now in anticipation of the discussions next year.
Okay, thanks. And then on the funding, because this is something we hear cities saying quite a lot in various public arenas, that they don't always have the access to the finance that they want and need to take action on climate change, whether that's mitigation of emissions or indeed building resilience to climate change impacts. Was there anything new on that coming out at Bonn? Any fresh ideas or initiatives that would help cities?
And this is something where we certainly need more work on. There was a positive signal towards the end of the week that there was official recognition of the Adaptation Fund as supporting the Paris Agreement. And this hadn't been the case before. It was there, but it wasn't maybe officially supporting. So that came through. And that's interesting to me, and I think to local governments, because they've made some advances on their direct access mechanism. So they have this mechanism where you can have implementing entities within a country that are helping to disperse these smaller pools of funding. And that makes it a little easier for local communities and local governments to access. And it's also sometimes coming in smaller packages, which is useful. Sometimes the multi-million-dollar pots are too much for some of these local projects. So that'll be something interesting to watch on how that's now being connected and fed in. Certainly more progress being made, but we heard some more commitments and some stronger statements, including from Adaptation Fund representatives, saying we're really trying to work towards this to try to make it even more direct, what we're doing here. In parallel, the coalition of stakeholders and local governments are doing their own work, and they're also pushing that agenda to try to have more support from global institutions and multi-level banks, while already putting their money forward. So in that reporting platform, our Carbon Climate Registry I was referring to earlier, we see about 70% of the funding for these climate actions and hundreds of climate actions, both on adaptation and mitigation, is coming from the local governments themselves. They're already investing in this and trying to look for diverse sources to fill it in. There's a group called the Cities Climate Finance Leadership Alliance, and many of their initiatives that were being put forward at the COP are different ways to sort of address this issue, but we're still looking for some more. There still needs to be some more support from the global and UN level to bring these forward. Mm-hmm.
Indeed. Well, thanks for that. I just wanted at this point to say, if anybody has any questions for our panelists, please do go ahead and type them into the chat box on the right-hand side of the screen, or at least it's on the right-hand side of my screen, or please leave them underneath the Facebook video. But I was just going to address a couple of questions that we had sent in before the webinar started to our panelists. Just sticking with the issue of finance for now, I have a question I think best addressed to Saleem, which is, do these talks help or hinder developing countries in their quest to find more funding for climate adaptation and resilience? I guess we've discussed some of that up to now, but what would be your overview of that, Saleem? Have we moved forward, or is it like Laura says, that countries are having to find money from their own pots because there just isn't enough washing around the international system?
I think countries are definitely having to find money themselves, and they're not waiting for the global funds to arrive. On the other hand, they certainly still want the globally committed funds to be available and reach the countries, and within countries, local communities, vulnerable communities, much faster than they are. So in a sense, the conversation, particularly on adaptation funding or for building resilience, has moved away from the COP negotiations to the GCF, the Green Climate Fund board negotiations, and the complaints from the least developed countries and other vulnerable countries is the difficulty of accessing these funds from the GCF, who have some funds. They don't have a huge amount, but they have some funds, but they're finding it very difficult to get that funds flowing to the most vulnerable. And that for a variety of reasons, one of them being they've made it very difficult as a procedural thing, which they promised to reduce the difficulties in. And they need to be reaching out to these countries a lot more and help them build the capacity to access the funds. So the arguments now and the complaints, if you like, are about accessing funds rather than getting more new funds. We assume that there will be new funds. We're still expecting the 100 billion a year from 2020 onwards. But it's how do we access the 10 or so billion that's already in the pot, sitting in Songdo in Korea and not getting out the door fast enough, which was the bigger issue. And this actually took place on the sidelines of the negotiations, where the entire senior officials from the GCF were in Bonn having bilateral meetings with country after country. I met one of the senior officials who said they'd met 100 different countries one-on-one to hear from them, and that they were getting an earful in terms of complaints, which hopefully they'll take into account and improve their procedures. So the finance part of it is more focused on getting the money that's available. That I think was the higher priority. And of course, having more money made available as well. And that's where the point that Laura made earlier about the Adaptation Fund comes in, because this is an older fund that has actually been running for a while, has developed procedures that are now much easier for countries to access, has a pipeline of approved projects, but doesn't have enough money in it, and can't access the Green Climate Fund because of procedural things. It was under the Kyoto Protocol and officially can't be part of the Paris Agreement unless countries agree. And one good result of COP23, and one of the items that kept them through the night on the last night, was getting that Adaptation Fund approval to access the Green Climate Fund and be accredited under the Paris Agreement, which has been achieved. So now we hope that some of the fund could flow through the Adaptation Fund as well, since they already have a practice and procedures and actually fundable projects on their books and didn't have money to fund them. So the argument on the climate finance part, particularly for resilience funding in the more vulnerable countries, was more procedural. It's about getting the money to the places which they're needed in, rather than getting more money. Where getting more money is always good, but getting the money you have to where it's needed is more important and more urgent.
And I think Bangladesh has some quite well fleshed out plans in order to be able to access some of that money from the Green Climate Fund, being a country that's widely seen to be vulnerable to climate change impacts. Could you just briefly tell us what's happening there, Saleem?
Sure. So in Bangladesh, actually, we are well ahead of the game. The government of Bangladesh has created a climate change trust fund some 6 or 7 years ago. And every year, the finance minister has been putting roughly $100 million equivalent into that trust fund to fund a whole variety of adaptation activities in the country. And so over the years, we've allocated and spent more than $500 million of our own money So we have a long history of doing things, using money reasonably well. I wouldn't say perfectly, but reasonably well. And hence we can now leverage that for accessing the international funding that's available, particularly through the Green Climate Fund. And we're very hopeful that Bangladesh will be able to do it. But having said that, Bangladesh is also having quite a lot of difficulty in accessing it. In fact, Bangladesh was one of the countries that had a project rejected by the board of the GCF because, in their view, it wasn't climate change enough. It was too much development. And that's always a problem with adaptation to climate change, because there isn't a fine line between adapting to climate change and just simply helping poor people, vulnerable people deal with the poverty and the problems that they face. And so that was one of the issues with the Green Climate Fund. They have to come up with simpler procedures for giving guidance to countries on what constitutes a project that is likely to get funded.
Right. And Debbie, I think maybe Oxfam has some views on that issue of funding as well, and whether it's getting easier and what the main blockages are.
Yeah, it was really on the loss and damage finance. So at the moment, you know, there is an agreement for this adaptation money for up to 100 billion. But I think we also need to look at, there's also a discussion around finance specifically for loss and damage. And I think this is where there wasn't very helpful progress at the COP. So I think quite a few countries, developing countries, are interested in looking at what they call innovative forms of finance, which might be something like a fossil fuel extraction levy or climate damages tax, depending quite what you call it. And I think it was essentially blocked by quite a lot of the rich countries who are scared of the kind of blank check, who are frightened of the compensation word and don't want to agree to more funding. But I think we do need to start looking at that more innovative methods of financing, because there really isn't enough money. And I think there is some quite interesting work now, which is not something that I'm involved in, but I know others are really looking at how we can be looking at attribution of damage around climate change, and could we be getting more funding from, for example, some of the fossil fuel companies. So, but the dialogue needs to start, a sensible dialogue needs to start on that. And there is going to be a one-off workshop next year on finance for loss and damage, which is helpful, but it's not really kind of hardwired into the process. It might just be, frankly, a bit of a talk shop that doesn't go anywhere. So I guess we'd like to see a bit more kind of solid progress around these innovative sources of finance.
I think if it's got anything to do with Saleem, that that will happen, because in one discussion we were in at Bonn, Saleem said he thought that maybe, you know, next year might be the year when that starts to get some more traction at the UN climate talks, although it is an idea that's been sort of around for a little while. I'd just like to, I've got a couple of questions that have come in here for Laura about cities. The first one is it realistic to expect cities to bring about change if national governments don't take the lead? And I guess we'll bundle in the other one, which is what role does data play in all of this? I think you touched on that to a certain extent with some of your comments about the global covenant, where they're trying to measure emissions and adaptation strategies and so on. But yes, I mean, without, for example, the US is a great example here, without that leadership from the federal government, what can cities actually do?
They're already doing it. So I think, I mean, this is sort of a principle of our organization, that it needs this multi-level action and this multi-level governance. But where you don't have leadership at the national level, it becomes even more important that the local governments are contributing, especially on the adaptation and resilience side, because rarely is a hurricane hitting an entire nation. Sometimes, but those local impacts are usually felt in the cities. And at the end of the day, it comes down to the mayor and the local city government to prepare for those and to protect their populations and to respond to those disasters and those sort of longer term stresses. So ultimately, these impacts are being felt in our homes and in our cities. And with the global population becoming more and more urban, the relevance of urban and local towns and cities as actors is only increasing. So in fact, I think this sort of devolution is becoming more relevant, and the leadership of the local governments is something that really makes a lot of sense. I mean, a lot of the things that we're seeing negotiated at the global level are things that cities are already doing sort of intuitively, and they've been doing for many years. The whole coherence debate is an example where there's deciding how to better link the Paris Agreement and the Sendai Framework on Disaster Risk Reduction and the SDGs. And when we pose this question to our cities at our Resilient Cities Congress, they just say, well, of course. I mean, of course, we're already doing this. It only makes sense. It's more efficient. And these things are all interconnected. So in our plans, we want to look at disaster risk reduction while we're looking at climate adaptation, while we're looking at urban growth and development. So I think, yes, the key point here is, though, that if we want to scale up and make this more effective, we do need that support from the national governments. So I think it's reasonable to expect local governments to lead, but they can maybe only go so far. And if we really want this to be an effective global coalition and to really hit those goals that we have, we need those partnerships at the local and national level.
Okay, thank you on that. And we have a question coming in via Facebook from Arun, who's based in Nepal, which he says is a country most vulnerable to climate change, which has been receiving funds for adaptation. However, it's always been difficult to track the funding due to a lack of open data, such as on a portal for climate funding. And so he's interested to know if there are ways of doing that. I think, Saleem, that might be one for you, because Bangladesh is actually doing some pioneering work that you're involved in.
It's actually a very pertinent question, because one of the problems we have with adaptation funding is knowing how much there is to start with, because many of the developed countries who provide it double count climate change adaptation with development assistance, and it's not very clear, again, which is going where. And then at the national level, once countries receive funding, again, it's very difficult to track where the climate finance is going specifically. So I think this is an issue that we need to collectively look at, the developed countries providing better clarity as to where the funds are flowing, and then the developing countries doing the same at the national level. And the experiment or the pilot you mentioned in Bangladesh is very much a government and civil society led together exercise on the government side to be more transparent with where the funds are going, and we're helping them build their websites and databases to allow all this information to be uploaded on the internet. But then on the NGO, civil society, and indeed media and journalist side, giving them the information in a way that they can then track how it's being used on the ground and see whether or not it's actually going where it's supposed to go. And if it does go where it's supposed to go, does it result in making things better and more effective for those that are the most vulnerable? At the moment, it's very, very difficult to do that. The information simply isn't available in a manner that enables people to do that. And so what we're trying to do is what we call what we're calling the climate finance transparency mechanism, which is more than simply providing information. It's providing the know-how to be able to access information and use that information. So there's a lot of capacity building at the ground level built into that for civil society actors, local governments. And the whole notion or paradigm under which we're doing this is what we call downward accountability of the government to its own citizens. It's not accountability to donors, but it's accountability to their own citizens to tell them where the money is going, how much the government is receiving and where the government is sending the money. And then people can then see if it's being utilized there or not utilized. We're still in the early stages of putting this, what we call ecosystem of actors together, but we've identified them. We've been having discussions. We've been looking at modalities in which we will facilitate this. The good thing is the government's very much on board, willing to be transparent, willing to engage, and be open to a certain degree of criticism as well, because that's always the difficulty where governments tend to shy away from being over criticized, and then they don't want to cooperate. And so the argument here is to convince them that it's in their own interest to reveal information, and occasionally if some things do go wrong, it's better to acknowledge that they've gone wrong and correct things rather than not acknowledge that they've gone wrong and say, you know, people are just attacking us for no reason. So it's not an easy thing to do, But I think we're making good progress, and every country is going to have to do that. It's the only way forward.
And perhaps every city, Laura? I don't know. I mean, I was thinking that, you know, this is obviously something that maybe cities have more experience of doing just because they're closer to the people that they're serving. And how does that play out in terms of data needs and how cities could support, say, an initiative at the national level like Saleem is talking about?
Yeah, in terms of data, I mean, this is really a recurring question and theme for us, especially when it comes to adaptation and resilience. I mean, the one question has always been downscaling this data to the local level, so it's in a format that cities can really work with. And there's been some progress on that. We're looking forward to the cities IPCC Congress, which will be happening in March. So there's this mandate to have a special report from the IPCC focusing on cities and looking on how we can provide some more support and data there. So there'll be maybe that conversation should come up more in this discussion here. But it's a recurring problem. There's different ways we can approach it. I mean, something that's very important is the partnerships, just like Saleem was saying. So private sector partners can often help. Sometimes this data is there, but local governments don't have access to it. So insurance partners are relevant here, universities, technical partners that can share their data sets with the local governments and also help them to use it. On the other side, the communities, often this knowledge is also, they understand their risks so they can understand their adaptive capacity in ways that the local government doesn't see. So having those multi-stakeholder partnerships is really helpful to tackle that question. Is there I'm not sure I fully answered your question. Was there a second half on that you wanted to?
No, I think you know, obviously this gathering of data and marshalling it into ways that can be very practical and helpful is something that's still kind of going on, and people are testing the waters. But I just wanted to try and squeeze in one more question that's come through on Facebook, which we haven't touched on so far, which is basically about environmental migration and the role that climate change plays in that. How was that addressed at these climate change talks? I mean, obviously there was some discussion around it, but it's a difficult subject, isn't it, for the negotiations to deal with, partly because governments at the national level have not made a huge amount of progress in terms of recognising migration linked to climate change or knowing really what to do about it. I'm just wondering if anybody would like to reply to that one. Saleem's putting his hand up.
Yeah, I'm happy to take that. So firstly, in the official negotiations, as I said, you know, UNFCCC has its own arcane language and ways of dealing with different issues that lay people may not understand or use. So in the climate change negotiation context, the issue of migration comes under the topic of loss and damage, because it's essentially when people have lost their ability to continue their livelihood in one place and they're forced to move because of climate change impacts affecting the environment. And so under what is called the Warsaw International Mechanism on Loss and Damage, which was agreed in COP19 in Warsaw, there's an executive committee, there's a work program. One of the elements there is migration, forced migration due to climate change. And that has been flagged as a high priority issue to be taken forward by setting up an expert committee on this to try and address this. But in the climate change arena, these are all seen as future things that we need to be thinking and planning about, and not just immediate problems, which in our view are actually more immediate than the negotiators acknowledge. If I might add on that particular point, another element that has simply come out of the blue, it's not a climate change issue, but is relevant for how things might happen that we might need to think about. And that is the almost overnight growth of a city in the coastal southeastern part of Bangladesh, where we are now housing well over 600,000 Rohingya refugees who have come across the border from Myanmar in the last 3 months. We're putting up shelters for them, we're feeding them, we're looking after them, we're giving them medical supply, the vast majority of whom, by the way, are small children, pregnant mothers who are giving birth almost every day here. Very few young men, lots of old men. And so all of a sudden, Bangladesh is now having to look after well over 500,000 new citizens that have just simply, they're not even citizens, they're refugees. That we don't recognize them. Myanmar doesn't recognize them. They're sort of in between, but they're physically here, and we're having to look after them. And this, in my view, is one of the most underreported globally problems around the world. It just happened within a matter of weeks and months. There's political negotiations going on to try and get them repatriated, but I don't hold a lot of hope in many people returning, either being accepted on the other side or even wanting to go back. And so, you know, it's a huge problem that we are facing right now. It is a national crisis of some sort, and it's an emergency where all the government of Bangladesh, NGOs, UN agencies, donor agencies, they're all doing what they can in terms of humanitarian response to this vast number of people, particularly young children who have just suddenly appeared. And that's the sort of crisis that, you know, we're looking at in the future. Exactly,
and that's, you know, it just goes to show how pressures on resilience can come from all different types of emergency or for different reasons, but at the end of the day, whether it's climate change or a conflict or some kind of pressures on particular ethnic groups, that has an overall impact on potentially a country's ability to deal with climate change effects if it's soaking up money that could otherwise be used for helping people deal with internal climate change migration. And, you know, obviously it's important to have a view over the whole of the situation. I'm aware that we're getting close to the time that we have for our event today. And so I just wanted to close, if possible, by asking each of our guests, what will be the most important thing for you going into 2018 in terms of feeding into the Paris Agreement process? In terms of the work that you're doing, what will be your priority for next year? Perhaps you could start with Debbie, if that's all right, Debbie.
Great, thanks. I think for me, I think there does need to be a lot more progress on loss and damage finance, and the migration issue just kind of reinforces that, because migration is supposed to be, migration is under loss and damage within the UNFCCC system. And yet, again, there's not a lot of progress. Lots and lots of talk about insurance, but not so much talk about migration. And this is stating the obvious, but it is, of course, the countries who have contributed least to climate change, who are feeling the impacts, and, you know, for whom migration is such a deep problem. So it's not only a metaphor, it's the reality that climate change is affecting the poorest countries much more. So we need to see much more progress on this. And this enthusiasm, this excitement for insurance must be balanced out by progress in other areas, including migration, and certainly around making sure that it is the poor people who are at the center of these efforts, not the insurance companies, not ideology around private sector leveraging.
We shall see on that, but hopefully it will be, as you say. Laura, how about for ICLEI? What will ICLEI be pushing for next year?
I think we'll really be following this telenovela dialogue process and looking at how we can leverage this to really show how to make these concrete links from the local to the national level, and to back that up with this data on what the gaps are, what the needs are, and what the climate actions and initiatives, local climate actions and initiatives are in different countries, and how they're contributing to those processes, to really help build that knowledge of how to build these partnerships and how to enable this multi-level governance. So supporting that process, and also the intersessional talks, where there'll be this official discussion from the Nairobi Work Program on how to do that on the adaptation side. So the May talks and the telenovela dialogue will be key for us.
So some quite specific processes and meetings and places where you'll be able to bubble up the voice of cities and local governments. Saleem, how about from your side?
Well, I think you know, I participate in the Conference of Parties every year. I've been doing that ever since they started. But it's only 2 weeks in the year, 2 out of 52 weeks. The other 50 weeks I spend on the ground seeing how we can build resilience. And I think that really is the proportion of effort that needs to go into practice versus talking. And in my view, in Bangladesh, in fact, we just concluded yesterday the second national conference on urban resilience. We held the first one last year and we held the second one this year, where we brought together several hundred actors from government, non-governmental actors, local government, mayors of local towns and cities. In fact, ICLEI was one of our partners there, to discuss how we build resilience. And I'll put in a nutshell what the problem is and what one of the kind of solutions that we've come up with. The nutshell of the problem is the potential migration from coastal Bangladesh, low-lying coastal Bangladesh, of 5 to 10 million people within the next 2 decades, all of whom, if we don't make interventions, are going to end up in Dhaka, which is already the fastest growing megacity in the world and simply cannot absorb another 10 million people. So the challenge is, how do we help those people migrate safely and properly, but not come to Dhaka? And the idea that we've come up with is to set up a dozen climate resilient, migrant friendly cities outside Dhaka and invest in creating the jobs, the health facilities, the education facilities to attract 1 million people per city to go and live there with a decent life as decent citizens and not have to leave where they are now under distress. That is very much of an idea at the moment, but it's getting traction, and we hope that we can build on it and develop it as we go forward.
I think that's an absolutely excellent example, Saleem, of what's happening in the real world and the way in which people are trying to find solutions. And then I guess the question is, how do we bring together those ideas, that momentum, those needs with what's happening at the global level and the international funding and what governments are doing in those negotiating halls to make sure that we get decent solutions for people on the ground who really, really need it. So I'd like to finish on that note and say thank you very much indeed for the contributions from our panelists, Laura Kavanaugh from ICLEI, Saleem from ICCCAD in Bangladesh and IIED, and Debbie Hillier from Oxfam GB. We will be following and covering all these issues on Zilient, so please do visit our website from time to time, as often as you can. It's www.zilient.org, and we hope to see you back for another event next month. Thank you very much, everybody. Goodbye.